Today is the launch of Familiar Evil. It's a true crime story of a case that happened right here in Baton Rouge involving television personality Scott Rogers, who was revealed to be a child predator living in our midst. I was contacted by email by a young man in the UK who was a victim as a child of Scott Rogers. And he contacted me because he'd been looking for Scott Rogers for 13 years online. And finally, I had written a letter to the editor about a problem I had with him, and he found that online and reached out to me for help. Before I get started on some of the story, I want to tell you a little bit about why we feel this story is newsworthy, for our community especially. It's about a man who betrayed our community, and he betrayed it by convincing people he was something that was really the exact opposite of what he truly was. And we found a lot of people who were taken advantage of, may have been embarrassed, some suffered financial losses because of him, and a lot of people left with a feeling of being duped. But make no mistake about it, he was a master manipulator, and that really speaks to his effectiveness more so than anyone who should feel that they were fooled by him. I've spent 2 years now working with some amazing young men who were betrayed by him in a very different way, and that's a much more damaging way. These are men who are now in the prime of their lives. They're in their late 30s, they're successful businessmen, they're husbands, they're fathers of small children, and they're men who want to make sure that other children don't suffer ever the same fate that they suffered. These are men who were raped as children. In some cases, they were beaten to the point of having broken bones or choked into unconsciousness. All of this because they resisted Scott Rogers' sexual advances when they were 10, 11, 12 years old. So learning from this story is what we feel like is important now. And our priority has to be on fixing a child services system that is very sadly broken. On August 28, 2013, exactly 365 days before the end of this story, I was in my office over on North Boulevard, and I received an email from someone I didn't recognize the name, had no idea who it was. I'm just going to read you a few parts of it because it was a lengthy email. It started off, I knew Scott Rogers in the 90s. He was accused of sexually abusing boys as young as 12. He was cleared by a court for the one case that was brought against him for sexual abuse. There were more boys who were abused, and I'm extremely confident he will still be abusing. He's a very clever, nasty little man. I can send you newspaper stories on the above case if you're interested, or can raise the awareness for any parents of children that may be in danger. Yours truly, and he signed his initials, but he sent the email with his actual name on it. Now, I don't mind telling any of you that the strongest feeling that I had on getting that email was fear. I didn't know really Scott Rogers. I was only ever in one meeting with him, and his behavior in that meeting was so strange that I knew something was very, very wrong, but I really had no idea what it was. 2 years before I received that email, our firm was asked by Joanne Morrow, who's here today, to work with her department to develop a public education campaign on local emergency preparedness. Now, we have a small public relations firm, and this is the type of thing we do all the time for clients, and it seemed like a good fit. Scott Rogers had also made a proposal to produce some videos for her, and we ended up working on this project simultaneously with 2 men who worked for his company called First Code. When Joanne had a problem with them, she called us all together for a meeting just to ask some questions and get some information about what they were doing. That's the only time I was really ever around him, and it was the strangest professional business meeting I've ever been in. He became very emotional. He basically had a meltdown in the meeting, and thankfully Joanne pretty much adjourned the meeting before it got any worse. It was very strange. After that day, he seemed determined to cause trouble for any one of us who he felt didn't just fall in line. He complained about Joanne to the mayor, and when the mayor supported Joanne's position, he became Scott's enemy. For me, he went to the newspaper with a story that was completely false, that somehow he had been forced to work with me on this project. When that story got published and I learned what he was saying, my only recourse at this point was to write a letter to the editor and correct the facts, which I did. And that letter to the editor included Scott Rogers' name, which he had managed to keep out of the original story. Now, I had no way of knowing that at the time, but that letter would end one man's 13-year international search for Scott Rogers. Because when a young man sitting at a computer over in England found my letter to the editor in an online search, he decided he would finally reach out for help, and he sent me that email. Now, as I mentioned to you, the first thing I felt was just fear. Who is this person? I don't know, and he's saying some pretty strange things. So the first person I turned to was a very good friend of mine, the late Nathan Fisher, who, if you didn't know him, was a brilliant criminal defense attorney. Nathan immediately advised me how to communicate with the man, who we call Ethan in the book, what questions to ask him, what information to try to get from him. And from the day I received that first email, I would talk to Nathan during the day, and at night send him a list of questions. Can you send us information on who prosecuted the case there? Can you send us the newspaper articles? Can you find out the detectives if they're still active and still working? Sent those off every night with the time difference. I'd wake up every morning, have all the information I asked for. It was like clockwork. Everything we asked for, we got. We learned from the news articles that Rogers had stood trial for a sexual assault on a 12-year-old boy who was a student at the academy he ran in a small town north of London called Bury St. Edmunds. It was a 2-week trial, and the young boy was cross-examined for 5 days. Now, that wouldn't happen today, as you know. And the trial ended in a hung jury, with the jury just very confused about this person in the community who had befriended a lot of the community leaders, and then this young boy who, after 5 days, was just confused about what had happened. The guy, Ethan, who contacted me, connected Nathan with the original detective who had investigated those charges and who told Nathan he felt very strongly that the young boy had told the truth. Now, while we didn't know much about Scott Rogers, one thing we did know was that he had adopted a little boy here, and he had very publicly told everyone on his TV show and other places that the little boy had autism. So Nathan, having dealt with sex offenders in his criminal defense practice, was very worried, as we all were, that this little boy was in danger. So with this little boy in mind, the one here, we began talking about what do we do with this information that we've been given about this man. So initially, that involved talking with a number of people, some in the news media, because the first thing Ethan wanted us to do was warn parents about their children being around him. But neither Nathan nor I really felt like taking this to the press was really the right thing to do. I mean, after all, the trial had ended in a hung jury. 20 years had passed, and it just didn't feel right to us. Nathan always preferred that we pursue this from a legal standpoint. And after a few weeks, he called me and asked me if I would be willing to meet with Mary J. Marcantel, who's sitting over here. And I tell her all the time, I think that was the best suggestion Nathan had of the entire investigation. I knew Mary Jane as a paralegal who worked with a lot of very top criminal defense attorneys, and Nathan had reminded me that she'd also worked with law enforcement to solve a murder-for-hire case here in Baton Rouge several years ago. So she really had a great perspective from both sides. So Mary Jane came over to my house, and I went over all the information we'd been receiving from Ethan, the news articles and everything, and she took it all home to absorb it and to start her own research. At that point, one of the first things she found was a press release announcing that the Louisiana Department of Children and Family Services had given Scott Rogers an award for being a model foster and adoptive parent. That night, I don't think she even needed a telephone to get in touch with me from Spanish Town to where I live, because I could have heard her when she first saw that. Because we all felt that he should have never, if you believe this story, that this information that we've been given, he should have never been able to adopt a child. if he'd been tried, arrested, and charged with sexual assault on a 12-year-old boy. And if he filled out all the forms accurately and told the truth, this should have never happened. So Mary Jane really honed in on this, and she suggested first that we make a public records request for his application to become a foster parent. However, Child Services refused to release any information, claiming it was all exempt from public records law. Now, this is a major disagreement we have with them to this day. While we totally understand the need to protect children, an application to be a licensed foster parent does not contain any information on that document about a child. So we really felt that we should have had access to that information. Without it, we decided our next step was to arrange a conference call with Ethan over in the UK, the man who had contacted me. Now, at this point, I'd been dealing with him for several weeks on a daily basis, and I was very comfortable that he was telling the truth. But I wanted everyone to have an opportunity to ask questions. So with two lawyers, Shannon Fay, who's in the room somewhere, with Nathan, who worked with Nathan, Mary Jane, and myself, we gathered around the dining room table at my house, and we called him in the UK. He was leaving work at the end of the day, and I said, "Is this a convenient time to talk?" He said, "Let me pull over on the side of the road, I'm driving." And he talked to us for over an hour. He very calmly answered every question that was thrown at him, including the most difficult one: what is your interest in finding Scott Rogers? At this point, I have to tell you, a young man who had never met any of us, with amazing strength and only a slight crack in his voice, told us that he'd been sexually abused by Scott Rogers as a child for 4 years, beginning at the age of 12. Our next step was to decide, what do we do with this information? Everyone believed him. At the end of that conversation, there wasn't anyone in the room that had any further questions. Who do we connect him with in law enforcement? This became a very difficult choice. First of all, we didn't think Baton Rouge Police would have jurisdiction because they lived in Iberville Parish. We knew he had claimed to be a reserve sheriff's deputy and a chaplain for the East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff's Department, so we weren't sure about going there. We knew he claimed to be a close friend of Colonel Mike Edmondson at State Police, so we weren't sure about going there. We knew he had gone to Greg Ferries at the Inspector General's office and took an FBI agent out to Joanne's office to ask questions about the project we had worked on. We knew other law enforcement officers had attended Better Business Bureau luncheons down at his house in St. Gabriel. So, where to go? Ethan was quick to tell us this was exactly what Scott Rogers had done 20 years before in Bury St. Edmunds. He worked really hard to develop relationships with law enforcement officials, elected officials, ministers, anyone in the community. It's no wonder when he stood trial, he had 17 character witnesses, which helped lead to the hung jury. Now, two quick asides I want to tell you. Another reason, not just jurisdiction, but one reason you don't hear Baton Rouge Police listed in that list of places that we wouldn't go because they were close to him is because of Don Kelly, who I see sitting out there, and who many of you have worked with at the Baton Rouge Police Department. Don's police instincts were that he was either a pedophile or perhaps even a serial killer, but he knew something was very wrong about Scott Rogers and the relationship he had with the people working for him. And Don, when asked by Chief LaDuff at the time about him, said, "I don't have a good feeling about him. I think we should stay away from it." And so Baton Rouge Police never got in that circle of influence there. Another quick note, once Nathan was convinced that Ethan was telling us the truth, he asked him, "You're a great witness, but can you find another?" And then when he found another, he said, "Well, one was great and two's better. Can you find a third one?" So Ethan went to work reaching out to some of the other boys who he knew were victims at the time. The second victim to come forward was actually a young man who was adopted by Scott Rogers in the UK and who was sexually abused by him for 13 years. When you talk about child services here, it seems to be a problem all over the world. Because of the abuse, he ran away 3 times from his home. Twice he was taken back by Child Services and returned to Scott Rogers. It wasn't until the third time, when he was over 18, that he was able to actually get away. Then Mary Jane called me with a suggestion that I really liked a lot. She knew an assistant U.S. attorney in Lafayette who specialized in prosecuting child exploitation cases. In fact, he had just received an award from the Justice Department just a few months earlier for prosecuting the largest child pornography bust in U.S. history. And the reason is the servers for that were sitting in Shreveport, Louisiana. So he had jurisdiction. Now that U.S. attorney's name is Luke Walker, and you won't be the first person to smile and think of Luke Skywalker. I think everyone does, and I think he's gotten quite used to that. But make no mistake about it, Mary Jane and I both feel this man is a true hero. He prosecutes other cases too, but he's very much an expert in child sex offenders. He knows how they operate, and he knows how to work with the victims to bring cases to justice. But most important for us, he did not know Scott Rogers. He did not know me. We could take him this information, and we could get an objective opinion on what should be done. And in Luke Walker, we not only found someone who felt that Scott Rogers was a danger to children, but also he very quickly described to us what the appropriate thing to do with the victim who had come forward. He connected us with a U.S. Postal Inspection Service agent in Baton Rouge named Allison Huffine, and she began this investigation. And that becomes the reason that I ended up, along with Ethan, spending the next 10 months as confidential informants to a federal investigation that was looking into what the truth about Scott Rogers was. We soon found he was in the process of adopting a second little boy, and he had told Child Services he wanted 4 more little boys. Now, you know from the news reports that the federal agencies ultimately worked with the state, removed the 2 little boys from his home, and you know that a federal grand jury was interviewing witnesses on the day that the shooting occurred, the murder-suicide of Scott Rogers and Matthew Hodgkins. They were looking at false statements on citizenship papers, permits to carry concealed weapons, applications for foster parenting, applications to adopt children. Nathan was able to connect the federal agents here with the law enforcement agency in Bury St. Edmunds, and they began sharing information. On their side, the victims were lining up to file charges against him for sexual assault on them as children. The UK has no statute of limitation on child sex abuse and no double jeopardy. So even the little boy who had the hung jury would have been able to file charges again, and he planned to do it. A few months after the deaths of Rogers and Hodgkins, I was having lunch with Jim Brown, who founded the Lisburn Press, and at some point the conversation turned to this story, and he said, "Are you following this story?" And I said, "Well, yeah, actually I am." And after we talked a little further, Jim says, you have to write this story down. It's too incredible. And then he gave me the best advice that anyone could give me. And when I said yes, I talked to Mary Jane, I talked to Ethan in the UK, and we talked about, let's tell this story and hope that some good comes from it. And then Jim said, before you can write this story, you have to go to England, and you've got to meet these people that you've been talking to for a year and you already feel like you know. So Sarah Powell over here, who's the owner of Composed Digital Design here in Baton Rouge, went with me, and we photographed Bury St. Edmunds, and we've put some of that in the book, and we're also working on a little short documentary that on December 9th we're going to be at the library here, and we're going to share some audio interviews. Obviously these victims are not comfortable being on television, but we do have some audio interviews from some of the former students. I interviewed 5 when I was over there. At the library program, Mary Jane is going to speak, and Leslie Todd over here in the pretty turquoise dress, who's a social worker, and contributed a chapter to the book because I wanted someone to explain to people how these child predators operate and what people should look for. And I think that'll be a great program. I hope some of you can come to that if you're interested. As I said, I interviewed 5 of the former students who were victims, and also a female student who was not, and a number of people here. The young men over there have identified at least 10 boys they know were sexually abused by Rogers, but the detective on the case tells us he believes there are many more. The way they identified them is that much of the abuse was group in nature. And what that means is, as these boys reached the age of 18, he would force them to abuse sexually a younger boy. Then he would threaten them to turn them over to the police if they said anything about him and what was going on there at the academy. So, as you can imagine, those of us who have been involved in this story are very determined that some good come from this. We hope to shine the light, first of all, on the child services system here that's completely broken. We have a new governor. We're very hopeful that some of the things, problems that are coming to light can be identified and addressed. As I mentioned, the book is released today. It's available at all the major bookstores, Amazon. It's available by ebook. Jim's already working with people in the UK because there's a lot of interest there in the story. It's always been carried on the big national London papers. There's a lot of attention there. I've gotten inquiries from some of them about running serial excerpts of it, and we'll be going back to London next year to work on that. I know this is going to spark a lot of debate, and I'm going to close with just one quick quote that's used a lot. We used it in the book because it's the way we came to feel about this subject matter in this story, and that is, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say that you did not know. And I just ask everyone to keep that in mind. The first good I hope comes is that we can take a look at what the State Department of Children and Family Services needs to do a better job so that children don't get adopted into the homes of child predators without anyone knowing that. That's the first and foremost. Secondly, this is a very difficult subject for people to talk about. It's squeamish, it's not easy. And that makes it harder for victims to come forward because they've told me, if you can't talk about it comfortably, that sends a signal to me that I should be embarrassed or I should be ashamed. And so I want people to be able to talk about this. It's horrific, but it's happening everywhere in epidemic proportions. And let's talk about it, call it what it is, and help those victims deal with it sooner. They need help sooner. They're coming forward in their 30s. They need to be able to come forward much sooner. The book's going to be on sale everywhere today, starting with Amazon.com. You can order it also the ebook, all Barnes & Noble stores, Books A Million. If you're in Baton Rouge, Cottonwood Books on Perkins Road. If you're in Denham Springs, Cavalier House Books already has an order, and they have them. So you'll be able to find it everywhere. We have a website, familiarevil.com. If people are in an area that they're not close to a major bookstore, you can just order it online. And I think this is a really difficult story, and a community was betrayed by this man. And I think we have to learn to turn it into something positive, and that's what we're hoping.